And thank you for the privilege of being here to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about in my personal life and in my professional life. I want to say a little bit more about myself. I have an MA in counseling psychology and an MA in English, and I'm very language centered. My English MA was in narrative development and literature, and I'm very much into what you say and how you say it. I'm also the parent of twins, so I get to practice my empathic communication quite a bit. And I have worked in publishing and as an IT executive and for the Burning Man Emergency Services Department for the event out in Nevada that unfortunately is not having this year, but hopefully will happen again in the future. And you will notice that Priscilla used they, them pronouns for me. And if you are interested in knowing more about that, come back next Thursday at this time, where I will be talking about gender inclusive communication. So today, we're here to talk about empathy. And what I would like to do is start off with a poll. So it looks like the majority of people would like to utilize more empathy in communication, but we are also interested in identifying and assessing communication. So let's go on to our next slide. So first, I would like to frame our discussion today. So in the next hour, I would like to explore the need for empathic communication. I would like to define empathy, and I'm going to have some famous guest speakers via video help me with that. We are going to review some basic listening skills, and we're going to look at a way to rate empathic responses so that you can judge your empathy a little bit better. And then, spoiler alert, the things that were on the poll, I'm hoping to accomplish today. So by the end of the webinar, I hope that you will be better able to explain empathy to someone else, to identify empathic communication, to assess communication for empathy, and to utilize more empathy in your communication. So what is the need for empathic communication? So right now, we are in really difficult times. So we've got COVID-19 happening, we've got shelter in place, we have got quite a bit of uncertainty. I think in my private practice and I work as an employee assistance program counselor in a tech firm and with other tech employees. One of the biggest challenges for people right now is that uncertainty. And the tech employees that I work with are getting a lot of mixed messages. Their management are telling them really positive things and using really empathic communication and encouraging them to take care of themselves. However, their workloads are, in most cases, not just not decreasing, they are increasing. And there are challenges around having the children at home. My two children, boy-girl twins, are doing school from home. And I will tell you at 50, I did not expect to be a second grade teacher's aide and an IT person for my 7-year-olds. So there's a lot of new challenges going around. And one of the other challenges is that if you were having communication difficulty already, this is almost like being in some sort of crucible. The heat is turned up, people are put together in places where they're not necessarily used to being all the time. Some people don't have the benefit of a larger place to live or a house or a yard. And some people just are not thriving well. My understanding is that unfortunately things like domestic violence are going up because of the people being put into situations that they really weren't prepared for. That being said, there are some really potential positive impacts for having empathic communication across disciplines. I will confess to you that I teach here at GGU and I never thought I would be teaching in a business school, but that's where the counseling psychology program is. And last year, one of my students in my, what I call Therapy 101 or Therapeutic Communication and Counseling Skills was actually a student in the financial management program. And they just wanted to learn how to communicate better. The author I will be most often citing during this hour is a man called David Martin. He's a Canadian psychotherapist who wrote the book that I use in my class. And he also had the experience of running into one of his former students who was a salesperson and was using the empathic communication that he had learned in his counseling class as a salesperson. So I think if you do your communication well, if you do your empathy well, it can benefit you personally and it can benefit you professionally. Not communicating well can have an impact on relationships. So it can create strife in personal relationships, something I just mentioned about the uptick in domestic violence. Just our fuses are pretty short in this situation for the most part. You can end up losing clients or employees in professional relationships. And also research has shown that there's a potential for negative outcomes like malpractice lawsuits. So I saw some research recently where people filing malpractice lawsuits against doctors, one of the common themes was the doctor didn't listen to me. There's also a negative attitude towards empathic communication. Working in the tech firm, these are actually some quotes from my employees, from their peers or from their management. I don't have time to be empathic, which says to me, I don't have time to communicate with you well. If you want empathy, tech is not for you, or business is not for you. And last but not least, why should I sugarcoat how I react to you? This is an interesting one for me as well, because working with gender inclusive language, I run into, well, why should I be forced to communicate the way that you want me to communicate? Isn't it my right to communicate the way I want to communicate? And these are not direct quotes, but paraphrase quotes from clients of mine who have run into these in their business environments. So I think it's fairly clear that we have a need for empathic communication in our personal lives and in our professional lives. One wonderful thing about being a therapist is if I'm being a good therapist and a good teacher, it's going to benefit me across the board. It's going to help my communication with my family and friends. It's going to help me communication with your clients. And this is what I'm encouraging here for you to be able to communicate better with whoever you're communicating with. So let's define empathy. First, we're going to go to Merriam-Webster with this very convoluted description of empathy. I go back and forth between reading on the screen. I'm not a huge PowerPoint reader from the screen. However, there are some times that we do need to do it. But I want to read this, and I have to tell you that I had to read this about 5 times before I really fully understood what they were saying. Empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Wow, to me, that's a lot to unpack. Now, David Martin, I think, has a more concise description of empathy: communicated understanding of the other person's intended message, especially the experiential and emotional part. Much more concise. And I think that intended message is what Merriam-Webster is trying to say in the not fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So you might want to take some time to figure out how you define empathy. However, if you need a little help, I have brought some special guest stars to help you out.
Hello, I'm Mark.
And I'm Murray.
And we're here to tell you about the word empathy.
Empathy, yes! Empathy!
Tell them about the word empathy.
Oh.
What's wrong?
Well, you're not gonna believe this, Mark.
What?
But I can't remember what empathy means.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'll tell them what empathy means.
Oh, boy! This is so exciting! Mark Ruffalo is gonna tell us about empathy! Oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy!
Can I do it?
Go, please, go for it, Mark.
All right. Empathy is when you're able to understand and care about how someone else is feeling.
Oh, right. That's what empathy is.
Yes, yes.
I don't get it.
What?
Sorry.
Okay, let me see if I can explain it to you in some way.
Okay, I'm gonna listen.
Let's say I'm walking along and, oh!
What?
I stubbed my toe. Oh, that hurts.
Oh, you poor thing,
Murray,
Mark. Oh,
Murray.
that hurts. I
It
can
hurts
imagine
so much.
exactly how you feel.
That's
Ouch.
it.
Oh, wow, what's it?
That's it. That's empathy.
What's empathy?
You could imagine exactly how I feel. You could understand just how it felt. That's empathy.
I still don't get it.
What?
I still don't get it.
Okay. Let's think of another way.
Okay, let's think of another way. Thinking.
Oh, Murray.
What?
Did I tell you about that time when I lost my favorite teddy bear?
Oh, no.
It was...
This is very sad. Did you love that teddy bear?
I loved that teddy bear.
Oh, I can imagine exactly how you feel. It's really sad feeling. It makes me want to cry like this.
It was sad. It was so sad. But you know what?
What?
You know what empathy is.
I do?
That was empathy.
What?
You could understand how I was feeling, exactly how I was feeling, and understood it. That's empathy.
I get it now. Yes! Yes, I get it!
Yes.
I understand empathy!
You understand empathy,
I'm
Murray.
so happy right now!
I'm
it
happy
makes me want
too.
to dance the dance of happiness!
I can imagine exactly how you feel. I want to dance the dance of happiness too.
Then what are we waiting for?
Let's do
it!
So yes, I like to inject a little levity and humor in my work. But the point is, if we can explain empathy to children that are watching Sesame Street, it should be relatively easy for us to understand it as well. However, that being said, empathy can be confused with a number of different things. So first and foremost, some people think that empathy is just personal warmth, being nice and being friendly, and in some cases, some people misinterpret empathy as flirting. Empathy can also be confused for caring for another person. The reality is you don't have to like someone to be empathic with them. I sometimes will say this, and I'll be honest, that I love all my clients, but I don't necessarily like all my clients all the time. But I do try to be empathic with them. So expressing empathy for someone does not necessarily mean you will like them. Likewise, agreeing with a person is also not empathy. So you do not have to agree with someone to be empathic with them. You can understand and reflect back to them without agreeing. And I think this is a challenge that people run into sometimes when they get people that are saying something that is contradictory to what they understand or what they believe. They don't fully resonate with that person's experience, so they believe that if they empathize with them, that they may be affirming or agreeing with them. But the reality is, the nature of empathy is just conveying to the person that you understand what they are going through. Now, above, we talked about sugarcoating. So some people think that empathy is just being politically correct. Why should I have to conform to what you or some other disagreeable person want? Why should I communicate the way that you want me to communicate? Don't I have a right to communicate the way that I want to? And if that's non-empathic and abrupt, I can do that. Last but not least, empathy is often confused with sympathy. And we're going to have another speaker talk to us a little bit about empathy versus sympathy, and that's Brené Brown, famous for her work on shame. And one thing that she says is that sympathy implies pity, while empathy implies trust. So let's hear her talk a little bit more about that.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred.
Sorry about that, folks.
I'm stuck. I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that if you do have questions, if you could chat them to Priscilla, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. So from Brené Brown, a few things I want to point out is that she talks about empathy as perspective taking. And Irvin Yalom, who is a wonderful therapist and author, he's literally the person who wrote the book on group therapy, tells a great story about a client who was driving with her father. They had had a difficult relationship, and she was hoping to reconcile that relationship on the drive to university. But the whole way he complained about how dirty this particular stream was. And she was very confused because the stream that she saw was clean and green and verdant. And some years later, she took that same drive and she came to realize there were 2 streams. On the driver's side of the car, there was in fact a dirty, polluted, ugly stream. And on the passenger side of the car, there was a green and verdant stream. So once she got to look out his window, she was able to see his perspective. Now, he shares also, unfortunately, in that case, they never got to reconcile. However, I love that story in terms of looking out someone else's window. So perspective taking, staying out of judgment. And people will say, I will say sometimes, I'm a non-judgmental therapist. I've come not to believe that. I have my judgments. I don't use them on my clients necessarily. But yes, we want to stay out of judgment. We also want to recognize the emotions of other people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And we want to communicate it back to them. That's the nature of empathy. So that's what I take away from the Brené Brown video. So what can influence empathy? When we first started, I said it was a privilege to be here. So yes, it is a privilege to be here. And part of it is my privilege to be here. I'm talking about empathy from the perspective of an assigned male at birth, white, educated, potentially overeducated person who's practicing therapy in California. This is not something that may necessarily resonate with people across the world. Some people don't have the benefit of receiving empathy, and some people don't have the ability to ask from their peers that they be empathetic. So your privilege can influence the amount of empathy that you can give or receive. Intersectionality. And by this, I mean the overlap of different influences. So for example, culture of origin. One of my students this year talked about if he spoke in what we were describing as an empathic manner in his culture, most people would look at him strangely and might actually even laugh at him because they would think, oh, you're weak, or you are, you're a person who's talking in a way that doesn't make sense to us. Same goes for family of origin. So you may not have been taught empathy, or empathy may not be respected in your family of origin. And also gender. Though it's not universally true, there's this expectation that female identified or assigned female at birth people are more empathic, and male identified or assigned male at birth people are less empathic. The culture you're in. So when I'm talking about my tech employees, their culture tends to be very alpha, very demanding, and that may reduce the amount of empathy that happens. And the reality is that some people are just wired to be more empathic. One of the truths that I tell my students is that in the end, it's easier for some people to be psychotherapists because they have an innate ability to be empathic. So David Martin talks about something called evocative empathy. He says that some people see empathy as a kind of warm and supportive reflection. Others think they need to gather evidence, give advice, reassurance, and clever interpretations. He cites Laura Rice's term, evocative empathy, which involves understanding what someone said, understanding what they meant to say, not what you think they meant to say, but what they are projecting to you, and conveying that understanding back to them. The responses that you get can go from merely factual to abstract emotion to evoking a deeper emotional state. And I want to talk a little bit about evoking versus provoking. Milton Erickson, the hypnosis teacher, who's known for indirect hypnosis, where he would do what's called a handshake induction, where he would shake your hand and in doing so could put you into a trance. Well, he wasn't always so indirect. When he was first teaching hypnosis, he would sit a subject down, and I'm not going to do this because I know a lot of you are wearing earphones, but he would yell sleep at them, which is provoking, trying to force an experience on them. So we want to evoke that experience, not provoke that experience. So quick review of some basic listening skills. First and foremost, attending. So presence is just more than being present. Yeah, presence is not just being physically there, but culturally appropriate eye contact, body language, saying to a person, I am here and I'm ready to hear you. Then we have acknowledgement responses, which can be things like I hear you, or can be a verbal or nonverbal cue. We therapists can sometimes fall into nodding or rote-seeming responses. I've been called out by my friends in text because frequently my response is to nod when they say something and they think I'm being a therapist. There are also what we call maintenance responses, which is helping the person feel understood. Often this might be paraphrasing. I'm a very musically oriented person and literature oriented person. So sometimes I will say, hey, when you said that, this is what came up for me. Now, these are fairly basic responses that don't really add to or take away from what the other person is saying. What we also want to do is hear the implicit message, and that's the hearing what the person meant to say. So we want to look for reactions. We want to pay attention to microexpressions. We want to understand the impact of what is being said. So the story, the implications of that story, and then the impact on the person. We want to understand what the big issue is. So when you said that to me, this is what stood out for me. And lastly, we want to assess nonverbal communication. We want to make sure what the person is saying matches to what their body language is. So I want to quickly take the second poll, and then we will get into finishing up in terms of rating responses. So most popular was that kind of situation can certainly arouse feelings of being cheated. And then some people preferred, I guess you feel cheated by that. And then no one preferred, there's no justice. And then 2 people preferred, I'm sure that happens to a lot of people. So now we are going to move into a particular rating scale, which helps us analyze this kind of communication. So social scientist Robert CARKHUFF created a rating scale in 1969. So why are we using a 50-year-old rating scale? Well, in some ways, it's actually better than some of the rating scales that we are using now. And one thing to note is that rating scales are by nature subjective. So I'm not saying that this is a hard and fast rule, but these are things that appeal to people across the board. So I didn't put the least empathic response. So I'm going to say the sentence again. It's not fair when less qualified people at work are given promotion. So the level 1 response, which does not attend to or distract significantly, I bet you're glad your privilege makes that not matter, with an exclamation point. So that's the least. That really takes away from what the person was saying. The second would be subtracting noticeable affect from the communication. So I'm sure that happens to a lot of people. So this is the response that generalizes. It's not specific to the person. And this is something we're running into nowadays because it is difficult for a lot of us. But if we respond, well, it's hard for everyone, we're not attending to the person that we're talking to. We're generalizing it. And maybe it's because we're uncomfortable or we want them to feel more comfortable. Now, that essentially interchangeable response is there's no justice in a situation like that. It doesn't take anything away, but it doesn't really add anything to the response. The fourth level of response, so we're getting a little more empathic here. It adds noticeably to the expressions in such a way that it expresses deeper level of feeling. That kind of situation can certainly arouse feelings of being cheated. Now, the challenge there is that's general. We're not talking about the specific experience of the person, which brings us to level 5, which adds significantly to the feeling and meaning in such as a way to accurately express the feeling below, and by that mean the unexpressed feelings, and to be with them in their deepest moments. I guess you're feeling cheated by that. So it's specific to the person, and it's an emotion or feeling that relates to the situation. So my students ask me, do you rate every response? No. However, I do use this as a guideline. So if I want to look at, how did I respond to that situation? Am I taking into account the specific person's situation, or am I being a little more general? So moving forward, some keys to empathic responses are to note the following things here. I prefer to use statements over questions. So if you're using a statement, you are reflecting back to the person what they said. The challenge with using a question is that by nature, most questions demand a response. So you are creating a situation where you may be putting a person on the spot and thinking that they need to respond. So if you can make an empathic statement over asking a question, that may be more empathic. Now, when using questions, and this is my language nitpicking here, I tend to prefer to avoid the question why, because again, this may put a person on a spot, it may put them in a defensive posture, and I tend to focus on the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how. And whether you're looking for an empathic response or you're just in conversation, those other interrogative pronouns, other than why, are probably going to get you a better quality response. So when you have a why question in mind, think about, can I make this into a how question? Or can I make this into a what question? What I have found in my work and in my teaching and in my life is that if I'm asked a why question, my response, and this seems to be a common reaction, is to get into a place of needing or wanting to defend myself. So preferencing statements over questions. If you're using questions, make sure you're not putting the person on the spot. And if you're using questions, make sure you're asking about the feeling state. How was that for you? That sounds really challenging. How was that for you? Don't fall into problem solving. Stay in the here and now. Stay in the present moment. So don't worry about what's going to happen in the future or what happened in the past. This is part of that attending. This is part of that staying present, even if it's uncomfortable for you and for them. And this is what Brene Brown was talking about in terms of vulnerability. Being empathic is vulnerable because you need to find a place within you to connect with the other person. So staying in the here and now, even though it's uncomfortable, staying out of problem solving. Another language nitpick I have is some people will think they're expressing emotions by saying, I feel like, or I feel that. So I feel like this situation is really difficult. That's actually a cognition. That's a statement saying, I believe, or I understand that this situation is really difficult. One way to think about it is that you can't follow the word feel by anything other than a body state or an emotion. I feel sad because the beaches are closed. It seems I feel cheated because I think it's unfair that the beaches are closed, versus I feel that it's unfair that the beaches are enclosed. Maybe I'm not being 100% clear on that, but I think you get the gist of that. And the last piece is being skillfully vague. As I said earlier in the presentation, I'm not always 100% great at being empathic, particularly with my children, though I'm trying to present a good example to them. Sometimes you're going to make a statement and it's not going to land correctly, and that's okay. We're all learning at this. I think we're trying to do the best job that we can. So this gets more into the therapist skill, but being skillfully vague, trying to convey what you understand that the person is going through. So these are some keys that I believe that are important to empathic responses. So the next question is, how do you develop empathy? Well, they found out through research that reading fiction can help you develop empathy. Now, I might say as a literature major, reading good fiction, but the researchers found that through a series of studies, we discovered that fiction at its best isn't just enjoyable, it measurably enhances our abilities to empathize with other people and to connect with something larger than ourselves. And one bit of research they did is they took a particularly well-known Anton Chekhov story and they refashioned it into a dry court report. So they presented their research participants with the fiction and the nonfiction, and they found that even though the data were the same, there was a small but measurable change in how people responded to the fiction, which was better than to the nonfiction. So another way is also to watch performances and to pay attention to what your reactions are. So this is how you connect with your internal experience so that you can connect with someone's internal experience. And also getting feedback. So I like to say, strike while the iron is cold. So not right after you give an empathic statement, you say, well, how was that? But later on, if it's a trusted person, being able to go back to them and say, hey, you know, when you told me about that thing, and I said this other thing, how was that for you? Would you be willing to give me some feedback on that? Because I'm working on my empathy. So getting feedback is important as well. So working in the tech firm, my employees really like to have, my clients, not my employees, like to have takeaways. So I would like to offer you some takeaways from today on what empathy is and what empathy is not. Empathy is focusing on the other person's issue without minimizing it or without silver lining it, going back to that great verb that Brene Brown coined. So minimizing, we might be trying to help them feel better or help ourselves feel less uncomfortable. But what we want to do is be with that difficult situation. Silver lining it, this comes up a lot in the conversations that we have currently around the COVID-19, especially in shelter in place. Oh, it's awful to be stuck at home. Well, hey, at least you have a 4-bedroom house and a big yard. The at least takes away from being empathic. So you also want to convey the understanding that you have back to the person in a way that addresses their feelings. You want to make sure that the person is heard and understood. And you want your empathy to be specific to that person and specific to the situation in the moment. So not having your own agenda around that. Empathy is not sympathy or pity. Remember from the Brene Brown, hey, it's bad down there. Too bad for you. And it's also not about problem solving or solution focused. There's a great cartoon I've seen on Facebook with these two amorphous creatures, one of which says, I have a sad. And the other one says, do you want comfort or solutions? And sometimes what people really want is comfort. Being there for the person can be what's important. And just to finish out the cartoon, what the first creature responds is, I want to be sad and I want to cry, and then I want solutions, and then I want to giggle. And then the other creature says, all right, let's get started. So make sure you're giving the person what they want. Do they want you just to be there, or they may want solution focus? And that may actually be an empathic reaction. Help me solve my problem for that person. So what are your action items? Practice responding empathically with your peers and your family members. So think about that rating scale. You don't have to take it out and go 1 through 5, but what are the quality of your responses? It may be that you've been making some responses that you believe are empathic, but are less empathic than they could be. Evaluate your own responses without judgment. As I said, we're all doing the best we can in a crazy situation right now. And get feedback from trusted individuals. So these are the things that you can do yourself to help work on your empathy. Now, last but not least, I have a test for you. They advised us to go easy on grading this year, so I'll give you a pass-fail, but I want you to take a look at this scientifically proven empathy test.
There's more to yawning than meets the eye. Research shows that yawning is contagious. And so when you see the word yawn, or look at photos of people mid-yawn, or watch film of actual yawns, you will start to feel like yawning. Also, the more you're affected by the images, the more empathic you are. So if you're feeling the need to yawn right now, then you tend to be good at reading other people's emotions. Whereas if you don't feel like yawning, then you're more of an emotional island. And so if you want to gain a fun insight into your friends, just ask them to watch this video and see if they yawn.
And that is what I have today to talk to you about empathy. I want to thank you again for having me, Priscilla, and I would like to open it up to questions. I also encourage you to give feedback because this is the way that I can make this presentation better in the future. So Priscilla, just let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. Folks are still, I think, typing in their questions. No questions yet. And if you are inclined to unmute yourself to ask Joe your questions, you're more than welcome to as well. Following this presentation, we will be sending a link to a survey, as Joe's mentioned, to provide feedback, a recording of today's webinar, and the slide deck. That was one of the questions that kept coming up. Any questions from the audience? Well, Joe, for me, I know that I really appreciate today's webinar, and I didn't realize that I do 100% minimize in my communication. When someone shares with me some news, I start my statement with "at least." So that was really interesting.
Yeah.
And that was a good takeaway for me as to how I can improve. Do you feel that that is a not a mistake or an issue, but a common practice that a lot of people seem to also do, that they do start with "at least"?
Not only is it a common practice, it's something I find myself doing a lot. And I think part of it is the desire to care for people and have them feel better. And it also may be, I want to comfort someone, or I want to solve my own discomfort. And I think there is a tendency to point out, well, don't forget the good things that you have. I see a question from Walt about comments from neuroscience informing empathy. I don't have any specific on that, Walt. It's something that I would love to look into. One thing that I am interested in is the idea of mirror neurons. So this idea that there are neurons on your brain that, from my understanding, can resonate with what someone else is going through. So I'm wondering if that is actually one of the sources for empathy, is this idea that we have a part of our brain that will, in metaphorical terms, vibrate the same way that someone else's brain. Now, of course, I don't have hard science on that. Something I would love to look into, but I think that's a great question.
Allison shared in the comments, I see a connection between evocative empathy and reflective listening. I'm not sure of the term evocative empathy. What do you think, Joe?
So evocative empathy is one of the terms I did introduce this hour. And the difference between evocative empathy and empathy is the idea that the evocative empathy can take the person a little forward from where they are. So it's not merely just reflecting back to them, but it's reflecting back to them with some added value. So there's definitely a connection between reflective listening and evocative empathy. What we're looking for in evocative empathy is what they say is below. So the thing the person may not have said. And just to be more clear about that, it's not what you think they meant to say, it's what you believe they meant to say and that they weren't able to express. So to be clear about that, I work with couples sometimes where person A will say blah, 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 and I will ask person B, what did person A say? And they say blee, blee, blee. And I say, well, wait, hold on. I thought they said blah, blah, blah. And person B will say, but they meant to say blee, blee, blee. That's different. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the example from that we use with the CARKHUFF'S scale. The person didn't say they felt cheated, but the response was, wow, you must feel really cheated by that. So it's taking them beyond what they're saying. Maybe they were afraid to say that they were cheated, or they didn't feel worthy of I'm being cheated, but we get to say that to them. So yes, for sure, there is a connection between evocative empathy and reflective listening.
Thank you. While I'm also appreciate the idea of focusing on the distinction between problem solving and empathy, do you feel that a lot of folks, I mean, I do, that's me. I get the two confused. So I really appreciate the slides and the practices of understanding how do I identify when I am doing one or the other.
Yeah, I do believe that that happens a lot. I also think that culturally, at least around here, and again, I can't speak culturally across the board, that we are very problem solving oriented. So part of the way that we may show love is to let me help you fix your problem, rather than let me help you sit here and be with your the challenge that you're having. I find myself doing the same thing, and I forget. You know, one thing I forgot to say about attending and presence is things like body language, where if someone's sharing something really sensitive to you and you're facing them cross-armed and kind of glaring at them, that's not very inviting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I think about my 7-year-olds, if they're sharing something difficult with me, or one of their classmates is saying, you know, I'm 6'1", I'm going to get down on my knees and be on their level with them, rather than speak from above, if that makes sense.
We have 2 questions, Joe. Carol is unmuted. Carol, what's your question?
It's actually not a question. It's more of an observation. One way to sort of catch yourself if you're inclined to use the at least response frequently is in the word least. Least indicates a minimizing.
Mm.
And that is
That's an excellent
exactly
point.
how the other person feels when I say at least. I tend not to use it a lot. I probably use it a lot more than I am aware of, though.
That makes so much sense. I really like that, Carol. Thank you for sharing that.
Next question is from JP. It's in the chat, Joe.
Yeah, I'm taking a look. So in some, it seems that to try to focus exclusively on the existential situation, those formulas, oh, okay, yes. So if I understand you, JP, correctly, it's making sure that the story that you're telling yourself in your head matches the story that the person is telling you. Does that make sense? Is that what you're saying? And if yes, so basically, yeah. I mean, it's a reductive way of saying it. I understand. Sometimes, what I will actually encourage people to say is, so the story I'm telling myself is this, and check that story with the other person. So on the one hand, not on the one hand, but in 2 things about that. One is that you're acknowledging this is the story that I'm telling myself. So this is what I'm hearing and this is what I'm narrating internally. And 2, you are checking that story against what the other person is saying. So it may match really well, and it may not match very well. Now, the challenge can also be this idea that sometimes we already know what the story is, so we're not necessarily listening, or we listen to the first sentence and we go, oh, I know what they're talking about, and then we're thinking about what we're having for dinner or what we're going to do later. So making sure that the story that you're getting is what the person in the moment is telling you, not your version of that story, which is different than reflecting back, what I understand you saying is XYZ. I think it's always safe to say, you know, my experience of what you're saying is, or what I understand you saying is X, and then they can respond, versus saying, this is what you're saying, which is actually imposing upon them your view of what they're saying. So I hope that answers your question, JP. I do want to reiterate, because I've seen it gone by, we are going to share the slide deck, so it's not proprietary. If you do use it, please give me credit. And I believe, Priscilla, that you will be posting the recording for download as well. So if your friends and colleagues could not make it, you can share it with them as well.
Lots of thank yous coming in, Joe. I want to say thank you as well. We still have 7 minutes if anyone would like to ask their question. Don't be shy. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Yep, I've got nowhere to go for the next 7 minutes. You are welcome, everyone. It was really my pleasure to do it, and my understanding from Priscilla is actually it was one of the most requested topics, so I feel really flattered to be able to talk about it as well.
Yes, it absolutely was. Well, oh, JP just responded.
Yep. And if you think about it, communication is a practice. It's not something that you master, it's something that you do, and when you don't do it well, you learn from it. You know, the point that Janice makes is great. One thing to do is when you're going to respond to someone, and this is another anecdote from a client of mine where they had a mentor that they admired and they thought, oh, I could never be like this person. And one of the things that they realized that that person's superpower was is that whenever they said something in the meeting, they paused. And it doesn't have to be a long pause, but they took a moment to collect their thoughts. So if you find you blurting out your response even before the person finishes, sometimes it's just prudent to take a moment and collect your thoughts and reflect back to the person.
Joe, do you have any tips on how we can remember to use the I'm not going to get the name right, the scale for how we're going
For a CARKHUFF'S scale?
Yes, thank you so much. Do you have any tips on how we can be more mindful as to how am I responding in terms of using the scale as a tool?
Well, one thing I would advise is not to get too attached to the scale because that you're not attending to the person. I think it's more a matter of staying in the here and now, staying present with the person and the situation that they're in. And are you merely repeating back to them, or are you including the emotional piece, the experiential piece? If you remember from the beginning when David Martin talks about it, it's conveying back the experience, particularly the emotional part of the experience. So I in some ways, I would say don't think too much about the scale. Just make sure you're being present, you're not going too far into the future or the past, and you are being specific to that person's situation.
Thank you. And another aspect of today's presentation that I thought was interesting, when networking, parroting is something that I use a lot to keep the conversation going, or even when meeting someone. And it's just a reminder that different practices and different types of communication requires different tools and different different set of, there's a different set of expectation there.
Well, yes, and one thing I say when I drop into role play with my clients a lot, but then I will say to them, you need to say it in your language. You can't necessarily say it in Joe language. So finding the things that are comfortable. As I said earlier, I'm a very musical person and I read a lot and I have a vivid imagination. So I tend to listen to my internal dialogue, because I do have one when I'm doing therapy or I'm listening to someone and going, wow, when you said that, it really made me think of this lyric or this image from this book or something like that. And that's a way of vividly conveying back understanding to people. But again, if you're not a literary or musical person, that's not going to work for you. But you may be a poet, and you can remember a line of poetry that is inspiring when you hear something from someone.
When we do respond in that way in the evocative listening, or just restating the story in our words, do you have any tips as to make sure that we stay on track in wanting to make sure that our story that we're sharing or that we're reflecting doesn't distract them and redirect the conversation? What if we are off the mark in our response?
Well, hopefully the person will give you some feedback. One challenge is that we do want to get to our part.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think it can be challenging to be empathic because we want to listen, but we also might need our empathy back as well. So I think, again, staying in a mindful state, staying present, am I addressing what the person is saying to me, or am I listening too much to my internal dialogue? That's the input I would give on that.
Thank you so much, Joe. Well, we are just about time, and so if anyone has questions, please email us, and we will get your questions to Joe. And as mentioned, the recording, the slide deck, and the feedback survey will be sent to you hopefully tomorrow, if not by Monday. It just depends on how fast we're able to process the recording up onto our YouTube channel. You could also go on to the GGU Presents website on the web form, and you'll see a list of all upcoming webinars, as well as Joe's webinar for next Thursday, Gender Inclusive Language, as well as recordings of all the previous webinars on our site.